So today's guest is Michelle Brown, EA. Michelle is an entrepreneur, enrolled agent, a wife, a mother, and a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. She tried to achieve success in the secular world, but she felt unfulfilled and like an outsider because of her beliefs. Michelle finally realized that taking the risk to create a business, or businesses in her case, where she could openly express her faith and beliefs and to put God at the center of everything she did was more exciting to her than the fear of the what ifs. So she did it, not once, but twice. She has the following credentials that she puts to work for you. She's an enrolled agent, so she's federally licensed to represent taxpayers in all 50 states. She's a certified nonprofit accounting professional with a degree in business administration and a focus in accounting, and she has a certificate in financial perspectives and over a decade of hands-on experience serving on a church staff as director of finance and working with numerous churches in her business. So, Michelle, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, Michelle, to get started, can you go ahead and tell us about your current role, your current business, and how you got started in this world of church finance?
Okay. I actually own a bookkeeping and tax firm that specializes exclusively in outsourced church bookkeeping and payroll, as well as clergy tax preparation. I this because I actually owned a Christian bookstore, and a national chain had moved into our area, was slowly but quickly putting us out of business. And I didn't know what I was going to do because I had, as my husband says, lived in my little bubble because I just had Christian people around me all the time. And I just started kind of freaking out a little bit, didn't know what I wanted to do. So I started praying about it, and God told me to go back to school and get my accounting degree and serve his church. So that's what I did. I was in my early 40s. I went back to school. I got my accounting degree. And then after I graduated from there, I got my enrolled agent license so I could represent taxpayers that were having tax issues. And that's how I got into it. In 2017, I opened my firm, and it has taken off beautifully since then.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I know you have so you have some Facebook groups and some other things set up around that topic, and I've gotten to personally benefit from a few of those. And so
Yeah,
I
cool.
just really appreciate the work that you're doing, specializing in church finance. Because as I've heard you mention, not every finance professional knows anything about what's happening on the church side of things.
Yeah. Well, it was really interesting. I have been a bookkeeper since 1996. And when I went back to school in 2012, I also took a part-time position on a church staff as their director of finance. And that's where I learned really quickly that church finances are a whole different ballgame from secular businesses. And it was when I went to seek help on how to do it, there was no training available whatsoever. So I had to teach myself and learn myself, and which is why I now have my podcast and my Facebook group, and I do trainings for churches all across the United States simply because there's no one place and one resource to go to get your information.
Right. So, in your experience, what are those key differences between managing finances for a church compared to a secular business?
Um, the very first thing I found out was that churches in general do not file annual tax returns. Just like an individual or a business has to file an annual return, churches do not. They are, even within the nonprofit sector, they're even more of a niche, and they are not required to file the normal 990s that nonprofits are. The next biggest thing, and the biggest thing that gets churches into trouble the most, is ministerial taxes, payroll taxes. They are totally, completely different. The IRS considers them a dual tax status, which, if we need to go into that later, we can. But the way that payroll is processed is totally different than a secular business. And certain guidelines. Being an EA, I look at how the tax code affects churches. So, ways that churches do things like inurement and who would benefit from this? And do you have this policy? What's this procedure? Things that if a church was to get audited by the IRS, these are things that the IRS looks for, which is again is specific to churches that aren't necessarily to secular businesses.
So, if there's pastors listening and they are needing help with their books or with their taxes, as an example, um, they're not necessarily going to be able to work with every tax professional or every bookkeeper that's out there.
No, absolutely not. The actual reason that I obtained my EA license was because in the office building that I was in upstairs was a church office. It was an offsite church office. So I would have conversations with the minister, and he was audited by the IRS. And he's like, he owed tens of thousands of dollars in interest and penalties. And he's like, I don't understand. A CPA did my taxes. I thought it was correct. So that's literally that day is the day that God said, you're going to help my ministers. You're going to help them with taxes. So I had to start researching, and the only thing I could find was if they get in trouble with the IRS, I can represent them. I can help them. Now I have to learn church minister taxes. But no, everybody, just because there's a title or those letters after their names, no matter how long they've been in business, minister taxes and church bookkeeping and payroll is a niche inside of itself. And it's not like there's no other industry out there, even within the nonprofit sector. Again, it's unique in itself.
That's really good to know. So, what are some of those common mistakes? And I know you mentioned one already, but some of those common mistakes that you usually see churches and pastors making with their finances.
Okay. Um, what the biggest thing that's going to get a church in trouble is payroll taxes because they're not reported properly. Okay. Um, Ministers are considered dual tax status, which means that they are considered a common law employee according to the IRS for their salary and wages, but they're considered self-employment for the Social Security and Medicare taxes. So it is actually literally illegal for an ordained, licensed, or commissioned minister to have Social Security and Medicare taxes withheld from his paycheck. It is against tax code. Okay. They by law have to file self-employment taxes, or SECA taxes is what you call it. So, and all SECA taxes is that the minister is responsible for remitting his Social Security and Medicare taxes instead of the church withholding and doing that church match. Okay.
Mm.
So, and there's way you can do the minister can either do his quarterly estimated tax payments, he can do voluntary federal withholding, which means that if the church has other employees and they're already doing their monthly 941s, the minister absolutely can do voluntary withholding and say, okay, I want this much withheld, remit it for me, but it gets put in his box two as federal withholding instead of the Social Security and Medicare taxes.
Got it.
So that's one of the ways that churches get in trouble with that. Another way that they could get in trouble, and I actually just had a client this week that they got a letter from the IRS stating that they owed several $1,000s in taxes when they actually did it, is because when they filled out their 941, if you only have ministers, qualified ministers on staff, and again, you have to be licensed, ordained, or commissioned in order to qualify for this. There's a box 5 on the 941 that says there are no wages subject to Social Security and Medicare taxes. And a lot of churches will forget to check that box when they put those wages in there. So when the IRS gets it, they're like, hey, you got these wages, where's the taxes for it? So then you get your notice, then you have to call the IRS and you have to do an amended return and yada yada yada. Okay. So the biggest way is just not knowing how to properly process minister taxes and making sure that you're properly filling out those quarterly 941 forms.
So, I'm just thinking if somebody thought that they were saving money by doing their own books without the right input or the right information, or they thought they're saving money because they just hired the bookkeeper with the best price or the CPA with the best price. But then they're having to go do an amended return and probably get tax advice to get that done.
Yes.
They didn't really save themselves anything, right?
No, they don't. And I actually just in the actually last week's podcast I did, it was avoiding pitfalls for churches and navigating the IRS is point number 3 of that episode was seek out qualified professional advice. Okay. I totally get because again, I worked on a church staff for several years. I did the finances. I understand financial stewardship, but stewardship for churches is so much more than just about the money. It's not how much money you're spending, it's how wisely are you spending those funds. Okay. And if you're just going out trying to find the cheapest bookkeeper or the cheapest payroll processor that's giving you the quote, is that really being a wise steward of the Lord's finances when you're going to end up having to pay more later in penalties and interest and having to pay somebody to fix, your issues that you're going to. So I always recommend, and I tell my clients, I am not the cheapest out there, but that's because I know what I do. Okay. I put in the education every single year to continue to study this. I study the tax code. I study nothing but clergy taxes. But it's stewardship is more about the dollar amount. It's about where is your money going, the money that it's being supporting, and what is your rate of return. And I tell them, I say, you get what you pay for. Don't always go looking for the cheapest. My God is not a cheap God. You know, he doesn't he doesn't want our leftovers. So we don't need to be seeking for the least out there. We want to get good quality help because I fully believe that, well, just between the late 2008 to the mid, say 2012, 2014, church audits quadrupled in the United States.
Wow.
Okay. So even though it's more difficult for a church to be audited than it is for a business to be audited, the ripple effect of a church being audited is much larger. So my job, and I feel my mission in life is to protect our churches so that they can continue to spread the gospel, to continue to help grow the family for heaven, because that's what we're here for. And we can't do that if the IRS is knocking on our door. Even if a church passes an audit, it's still the stigma within the community. It has already done its damage. So we need to prevent it from even happening in the first place.
Right. Wow. That's quadrupled. That's crazy.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
it is.
that's 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 significant. So, how can church leaders ensure that they're maintaining financial compliance and transparency, and why is that important?
Okay. First of all, you got to know what you need to be doing. So many times I have members that come to me that are in my small group settings or that are in my group coaching sessions, and they just don't know what they don't know. Okay. So you got to educate yourself. Educate, educate, educate. I'm huge on education. So you need to know the tax code. And if, most ministers are not geared towards the finance part of the church because that's not their baby. Okay.
Hmm.
They're there to equip the saints for the work of the kingdom. They're there to, preach the sermons, to do whatever needs to be done, with that to help spread the gospel. But you have got to have somebody, either a volunteer in your church, a paid staff member, or an outsourced paid professional who knows churches, who knows the compliance, who knows, are you in compliance with 501c3 requirements? A lot of churches think that just because you're automatically exempt, that you're good to go. What they don't understand is if you ever get audited, or a church member of yours ever gets audited and they are giving donations to the church, if their donations come in question, they have to prove that their church meets the requirements for the 501c3 qualifications. Okay. That burden should not be on your church members. All right.
Mm.
So there are different things that churches have to do in order to meet those requirements, even though you don't have to file the official paperwork because you can go under a denominational umbrella. You still have to prove that you meet these requirements. Okay. So you've got that compliance, you've got your payroll tax compliance, and then you have your compliance with certain things that need to be in your articles of incorporation, in your governing documents, certain things that need to be in your policies and procedures that a church has. So a pastor already has so many things on their plate. They cannot do everything. So you've got to find someone that you can trust, whether that's inside your church walls or paying an outside professional. And you've got, again, that stewardship. Are you seriously being wise stewards of God's finances if you're not willing to spend the money to make sure that you're in compliance so you can keep your church doors open so that you can continue to spread the gospel?
Right? Because we're not pastors are not going to, in the vast majority of cases at least, pastors are not going to be have the financial background um, or have the bandwidth to drill down on the tax code all the time, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like as leaders, there's going to be times where we lead somebody that works on something we know almost nothing about, but we have to know enough to be able to manage and lead that person well. Enough to know what questions to ask and
Mhm.
what kind of person, what qualifications am I looking for. So I'm not just looking for the volunteer in my church who happens to be an EA necessarily or happens to be a bookkeeper, unless they're willing to go learn all this stuff.
Yeah. 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 Well, definitely for EAs, we are actually required by the U.S. Department of Treasury. We have to do continuing education. We have to do a certain amount of hours every year to keep our license. So, you know, the education can be done, but the big thing is you've got to stay up to date because the tax code changes constantly. There are always court cases. I mean, housing allowance has been battled in the courts for the last 10 years. And it's still, somebody's always bringing it up, trying to assault that. We've got to stay on board and as I said, we got to protect our churches. That's what we got to do. We got to keep the doors open. We got to keep that hope going in our little corner of the world.
Right. Um, so I didn't have this in our notes, but what would be some of the things that, say, the lead pastor or the executive pastor needs to know in terms of so that they can hire for that position or supervise that position well? What would
Okay.
be some of those foundational things they would need to know?
All right. First of all, you need to make sure that your organizing documents are in compliance with 501c3. Okay. There's two things that a lot of, I'm in the state of Kentucky. Okay. Even for a nonprofit on your articles of incorporation, there's a little blurb at the top of the papers that says these articles do not conform to IRS 501c3 regulations in really tiny print. Okay. And that's because it's just a one sheet document. It's easy peasy mac and cheesy. They go online, they fill it out, boom, you've started your church. Okay. The IRS wants a dissolution clause in your organizing documents. They also want they want the dissolution clause and they want the purpose clause listed in there. So if you ever get audited, they're going to look for those two things. Okay. And if you do the official 501c3 application, which is the Form 1023, you have to send in copies of that to make sure that those things are in there. Okay. So the first thing you've got to do is you got to make sure your organizing documents are up to par. Second of all, if you're looking at an individual, You don't want someone that just says, I've been in business for years. Okay. What do you mean you've worked with churches? There are lots of people that work with churches. I get churches all the time that came from another accountant or CPA office, and it was an absolute mess because they don't understand. First of all, they don't understand ministerial taxes. Second of all, is fund accounting, all of your designated funds. They don't understand how those work, how those need to be tracked. What is a restricted fund versus a designated fund? What is considered a charitable contribution and when is it not considered a charitable contribution? Um, so these are things that they really need to look into. So if I'm going to recommend, this is how I'm going to say, okay, what is your training specifically in churches? What can you tell me about minister taxes? What makes them so unique? What about housing allowance? You'd be amazed how many CPAs and even third-party payroll processors have no clue how to do housing allowance. Okay. Housing allowance is the largest tax benefit a qualified minister has, and it needs to be instituted and initiated properly for the minister to claim that because he can get significant tax savings, but he can also get in significant tax trouble if it's not created correctly. Okay. So you need to know. So I would start with that is tell me about, what's so unique about ministers? What do you know about housing allowance? And about what's the difference between restricted or designated funds? And if they cannot give you a clear answer on those three things, move on. It's not my job to educate my bookkeeper on how to take care of my books. If I know more than my bookkeeper, they should not be my bookkeeper. Just saying. If
Right?
I'm going to pay you to do a job, you better know how to do it better than I do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you for that because those questions are something a leader can ask even if they're not super strong on the answer. You can tell by the person answering
Yes,
if that question came out of left field for them, if they're not comfortable in that
exactly.
area, or if they can't explain it to you.
Yeah.
Because that's the other thing is if you hire a professional but they can't speak pastor,
Yeah, I get it, girl.
you're gonna
I
have a
get it.
little bit of a problem.
Yes, you are. Yes.
So let's see. So where are we? So what would you say in terms of budgeting and financial planning? What are some best practices for churches?
Okay. Believe it or not, the very first thing is have a budget.
What?
You'd be amazed how many churches do not have a budget, and they also are not aware it is an IRS requirement to meet the 501(c)(3) qualifications. Because again, when you file that Form 1023 paperwork, you have to include a copy of your budget. Okay. So I've had clients when I take them on, they don't have a budget, and I'm like, we got to get a budget going. It's a budget is, you know what? Easiest way to do a budget if you don't have one is however long you've been in business, take the last 3 years. This is how much we brought in. This is what we spent on, put it in a spreadsheet. And you budget for tithes and offerings, $400,000. This much is for salaries. This much is for administrative. This much is for buildings and grounds. Just get something in there because budgets are fluid. They're not written in stone, people. They're written on paper. You can erase them. You can change them anytime you need to. But you need to have a budget and you need to budget for income and expenses because if you don't, number one, you're not meeting the 501(c)(3) requirements. And number two, how on earth do you know how you're doing? How can you gauge the financial stability of your church, of your organization, if you don't have something to compare it to?
How can you know if you're managing it well?
Exactly.
If you don't have
Exactly.
a plan, you're
Where's
not
that?
managing it well.
Yeah, where's that transparency? How are your people? If you've got someone coming into your church who's a very generous donor, they're probably going to want to see some type of reporting of saying this is where our funds are going. Or if someone comes in and, they're like, well, how much do you generally spend in this ministry or this area of the church? And if you got nothing, girl, you may have just lost that big old nice donation that you needed.
Because people need to have that generous donor is trying to be a good steward too.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep.
They need to know that they're putting it in a place that it can be well managed,
Yes, ma'am.
because
Yes.
they're responsible for it until it crosses over your doorstep, right? And they
Yes,
got
they
to make
are.
sure they're sending it the right place. So
Yep.
uh, so let's talk about, this is a hard one. This is such a hard question. um, Financial, fair compensation and staff benefits. We all know a lot of pastors that are not paid or not paid very much. So, how can pastors and church leaders ensure that they're providing fair compensation and benefits to their staff?
Okay. Um, First of all, the first thing that comes to my mind, again, I always think IRS regulations, is you've got to make sure that the entire compensation package, what the IRS goes by, is reasonable compensation. Okay. So not only most churches struggle with they're not paid well enough. Okay. But there are some churches and the IRS looks at, are you paying them too much? Believe it or not. Okay. So I get asked this more than not of how do we know we're paying our ministers and our staff members a fair price? Again, if the IRS is going to come in and audit you, they're going to say, okay, if you look at another church in your area with a comparable membership size, okay, and comparable duties, how much are they paying their minister? Okay. If you're in an area where you don't have another church comparable to your size, the IRS says that you can look at school teachers. If you look in the local school system where you are, you can compare the your senior pastor's staff salary should be comparable to the principal of that school because the principal is the head of the organization, just like the senior pastor is the head of the church organization. Okay. Um, so, and believe it or not, right now, the hottest ticket out there, the staff member that's bringing in the highest demand for salaries are music ministers because they are
Interesting.
so in demand and there's such a shortage that music minister salaries are going increasing on the most because they're so far and few between. They're hard to get. Okay. But again, there's something that you can do, there's reasonable comp salaries. Um, Church Law and Tax does a church compensation salary report every year that says in this area of the country, this is how much senior pastors make. This is how much executive pastors and music ministers and youth ministers and blah, blah, blah. But basically compare it to others in your area, comparable church sizes, or if you don't have that, school systems in your organization, in your area is how they compare those two.
It's interesting. I never would have thought of the school systems, but that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. That's what the IRS will use if there's not another church because there are, and that's again, that's your whole compensation. And don't think of it's not just your hourly salary. Okay. For your secretary, it's what are they getting paid hourly on an hourly basis? All right. But for your minister, you should be constructing a compensation package where this much is salary, this much is housing, and then looking at what other tax-free benefits can we offer to our ministers. And it's the whole package, the whole kit and caboodle, as I say. That's what the IRS looks at is this reasonable for someone in their position in their area of the country? And there are it's sad, but there are so many pieces, and I have some that are tax clients that are severely underpaid. I've got tax clients, I've got, that have not had a raise in 20 years. I'm like, are you kidding me? You know,
Wow.
even everybody gets a COLA raise, which is a cost of living. Okay.
Right.
They get a cost of living raise. Even if you're on Social Security, you get a cost of living raise. But there are churches out there that actually think we pay our pastor enough. He only shows up on Sundays or Wednesday nights. And I'm like, that's bull. No, you have no idea until you work in a church office or on a church staff how much time a minister is actually not working because they are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Right.
So I
So,
think they're way underpaid.
well, hopefully we can at least help some of our churches get be able to better manage their finances and also solve some of that problem, as
Yes.
a result, right? Because those
Yes.
things go hand in hand. If the church isn't healthy financially, they won't be able to pay their staff. They won't be able to get the staff they need, um, or
That
those
is
staff
correct.
members are out working, another full time job, which for some people that's their calling, but
Mhm.
that also does pull away from what you're able to do for the church
It,
as well.
yes, it absolutely does. And most churches, on average, your entire salary is going to be about 40 to 60% of the annual revenue that's brought in for the church is going to go for salaries. Now, of course, the smaller your church, the smaller your budget. It could very easily be 50 or 60% is going for, but on average, you're looking about 40% of the annual revenue should be going for salaries and wages for your employees. So if you're, over here and you're bragging, hey, we only got 20% going for salaries, you need to be seriously looking and reevaluating how much do you actually appreciate the staff that you have.
Right. Wow. So, what advice would you give to pastors who are struggling to effectively manage their church finances?
Okay. You may not like this answer, but I'm going to give it. A pastor should not be managing the finances of the church. What your church treasurer and or your church bookkeeper and your finance team and your stewardship team is for. The pastor's job is not to manage the finances. The pastor's job is to shepherd the flock, to take care of the church, to spread the gospel, to focus on the calling that God has put on his life or her life. Okay. I understand that in many small churches, it is the pastor who is in that role. All right. But as soon or more so often, it's the pastor's wife who gets stuck in that role, and it's you've got to have once your church is in a position, you've got to look at segregation of duties. Okay. And the pastor should never ever know who gives what in the church. They just shouldn't. It they can say it doesn't, but it clouds their judgment. It affects how they look at certain members. Um, if they see how much, certain members are giving or not giving. It's just human nature. There are always exceptions to every rule, but in general, it's just not wise decision for the pastor to know who's giving what and how much. Um, so I'm going to say, I'm going to stick with they just shouldn't be managing it. But if you have to, as quickly as possible, find somebody that you can trust to put them in that position. Okay. And if you don't have someone within the walls of your church, outsource it. Outsourcing is there are some churches that like everything done in-house, which is fine if you have the knowledge within your doors. But there are some people that finding that outsourcing where you've got a bookkeeper that's 40 hours a week, you need to be paying them, say, $15 an hour. That's $600 a week, $2,400 a month. Okay. You can outsource your bookkeeping, say for $500 or $600 a month. You know it's done correctly. You've got that second look, second pair of eyes on the look for accountability, because hopefully you still have a church treasurer who's seeing the reports, who's going over the financials, but you have this paid professional that doesn't have that connection with the church, that's making sure that everything is the way it needs to be. And look how much money you've saved, you
Right.
know? So it depends on where the church is as to whether it's get a volunteer inside or pay somebody to do it. I promise you, it's worth it to pay somebody outside to do it if you don't have the means to do it, have it done in-house.
So there's pastor listening, and maybe they have somebody in their congregation that's doing it, but they just feel like, hey, we're struggling, or I've heard some things on this call, and I'm like, I'm not sure, like, what should I do next?
Okay. Um, I just recently got a client who has had someone in the position, and they just didn't get it. Sometimes things just don't click, no matter how hard you try to do some jobs, it's just not your thing, you know? So we had a conversation. We looked over their books and we pointed out several things and inconsistencies and things that needed to be fixed. And so they hired my firm, and we now do their monthly bookkeeping. They have someone on staff in the office that still writes all of the checks. They still, at the end of the month, they give me so I can categorize it, but I'm making sure that everything, first of all, that the reports match, because they were not having their financials literally could not be approved because they were never correct. Okay. You've got to have, it's just like with anything, and this is not meant to be disrespectful, but garbage in, garbage out. You can only get out of a computer system the information that you put in it. So you've got to make sure that you're putting it in correctly. Okay. So you can either outsource that part of it or get them some training. Get them some training. I'm working on my first course, which is Intro to Church Finances, which I go over in the modules. These are qualifications for a bookkeeper and a church treasurer. These are responsibilities that your bookkeeper and your church treasurer needs to do. These are basic church bookkeeping. We go over, these are basic policies and procedures that you need to have on your church. This is what debits and credits are. This is how you do contribution statements. This is how you do restricted and designated funds. There are basics that if you're going to work in a church office, you need to know, because if you're in that office, you are responsible for that reporting and making sure that it is get done, because in your church, and whoever is listed as the treasurer on your state, the IRS can go after them. They can hold them legally responsible if they get audited and something doesn't look right. And a lot of church treasurers don't realize that they have a legal responsibility to make sure that it is done correctly.
So it sounds like that course could be something, maybe to train the person you already have working with you, or if you've been listening to this and going, okay, I need to bring somebody in, but it's going to be a volunteer from within my church, I can
Mhm.
have them go through this hopefully soon to be out there course.
Yes, I'm 3/4 of the way done. I've got two more lessons to do in my final module, and then I just have to record all the videos. So it's just a matter of getting it out there. But if you've got someone in your church that you believe has the mental capacity, that has the intelligence and the desire to learn how to do church finances and to do it properly, just get them educated, give them the best kick off and start off that they can get, so that they set up that solid foundation of knowing these principles that are going to protect the church.
It sounds like some of that information in the course, and I don't know how you'll have it set up, but
Mhm.
would be useful things just for whoever is supervising that person to be also aware of. They don't need to know the nitty gritty of how to tactically do things in the computer system, but they need to know these are the questions I should be asking my bookkeeper.
Absolutely, yes. And as far as the responsibilities and then the qualifications, I actually give you checklists to go through. So if you're interviewing someone or thinking about someone, and then the policies and procedures these are policies that you need to make sure that your church has in place, because there are certain financial policies that the IRS will look for if you get audited. So we want to make sure that the church has them. And then again, that specific jargon that they're looking for, the little IRS blurbs and the clauses that you need to have in certain documents.
All right. Yeah. Let's not give the IRS or the enemy a foothold, right?
Exactly. That is exactly it. Never give, I always tell my clients, never give the IRS more money than they're legally due, and never give Satan a doorway in.
Right.
Just don't.
Yeah. So this has been just super helpful, and I have the transcript of this recording, so I didn't have to rush and take notes, right? But just an incredible amount of knowledge and value that you've brought to us today. So thank you
Well,
so
thank
much for
you.
that. So where can people connect with you online and learn more about what you're doing and get connected with this course that's going to be coming out soon?
Okay, cool. Yeah. So you can check me out at churchfinances.org is my website. The waiting list, if you want to sign up for the waiting list for the course, is intro to churchfinances.com. And then I have a fantastic Facebook group. We've got about 2,400 people in there that are all church finances. That is wonderful on Facebook, and it's Church Bookkeeping and Clergy Tax Group. You can request to join that. You do have to answer the questions. I don't let just anybody in. You need to either be volunteering or working on a church staff or be a business that has church clients. And then you have to agree that we're not mean there. We're there to learn. We're not there to sell services. And we're not there to be rude if somebody doesn't know anybody something, because everybody is at their own learning level and everybody's got to start somewhere. So we have a great, just a fantastic community of people. I love them. They do a great job of taking care of each other. But that's it, churchfinances.org and intro to churchfinances.com. Or if you need to email, it's Michelle at hallmarktext.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I'll
Yeah,
make sure to drop those links in the show notes for people too.
yeah, I appreciate it. It was fun. I can talk church finances and clergy taxes all day long.
Yeah. And what can you remind us what the name of your podcast is?
The podcast is the Church Finance and Minister Tax Podcast.
Awesome. I
So
wanted
I'm
to make
on.
sure we got the new name.
Yes, yes. I just rebranded about a month ago, because I'm like, you know what? It is what it is. This is what we do. We do church finances and minister taxes. I'm on Apple Podcast. I'm on Spotify and Google. And even if you don't have any of those, you can go to my website, which is thechurchfinances.org/podcast, and you can find the podcast there and listen to them on your web browser.
Yeah. So I just want to give a pitch for your podcast because what I love is that for ministers or people who are not working, and I know that some of your listeners are going to be people who are doing the actual bookkeeping, but
Mhm.
you're going to have some church leaders and other people listening too. For those of us that are not doing this hands-on every day, if we sat there for an hour and a half and listened to financial stuff, it would be completely overwhelming. But your episodes are usually pretty short.
Mhm.
Um, I want to say like in like the 15-minute range usually, and
Yes,
they're
I try
just
to keep
these
them 15 or less.
It's perfect. It's just these bite-sized nuggets that then give us an action item that we can go look into something. And I can just tell you on multiple occasions I've listened and then I've gone and asked our team a question like, "Hey, do we know about this?"
Yay! Yay, thank you.
So, or or put it on my list to follow up on because it's not overwhelming. Just because the nature of the material,
Mhm.
a lot of people hear taxes and they're just overwhelmed. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah,
and
you can be. Now, I will tell you, next week's podcast, I recorded it today, is a few minutes longer because I had a church who was just the victim of a QuickBooks scammer.
oh wow.
So I put on there, this is what they said. This is what you need to look for. These are the red flags. So it's a little bit longer, but yeah, usually about 10-15 minutes, people start to gloss over. So I'm like, hey, we're good. We're good, which is good for
That's
me because I don't have to come up with something really long.
right. It's perfect, but definitely a great resource. So
Thank
I
you.
highly recommend it. I think I've sent it to 3 or 4 people in the couple months that I've been listening already. So
Yay.
yeah,
Thank you very
well,
much. I appreciate that.
Michelle, thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to seeing your course coming out and more of the great stuff that you're doing. You're providing such a value that helps us as pastors go do what we're supposed to do, and
Yeah.
so
Thank
I'm
you.
just super thankful, and I look forward to seeing more of it.
Yeah. Awesome. That's great. I appreciate you having me.